Well, good afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the 2014 Kenai Classic National Recreational Fishing Roundtable. I'd especially like to thank each and every one of our honored guests for attending, starting with Alaska Senior Senator, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator Mark Begich, our distinguished panel, starting at the far end with Pat Murray, President of the Coastal Conservation Association, Mike Nessman, President and CEO of the American Sportfishing Association. Sitting next to me, Tom Domerick, President of the National Marine Manufacturers Association, and I'm your moderator today, Phil Disco. I'm the immediate past president of Yamaha Marine and a Kenai River Sport Fishing Association board member. Also like to introduce our VIP guests today, starting with Ben Special, the president of Yamaha Marine, Bill Shedd, the president of the American Fishing Tackle Company. Bill is also vice chair of the Center for Coastal Conservation. Ellen Peel, president and CEO of the Billfish Foundation. Jeff Mullins. Jeff is the chief operating and communications officer for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Ricky Geese, executive director of the Kenai River Sport Fishing Association. And Mark Hamilton, board chair of the Kenai River Sport Fishing Association. Now, we're here today to talk about the Magnuson-Stevens Act, we call it the MSA, and the very important upcoming MSA reauthorization. We also have a couple of other important recreational fishing topics as well. Now, before we begin, it's important to remember that MSA, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, only speaks to saltwater fishing in federal waters. Now, going back to 1976, this MSA has had a solid history of accomplishment. It's responsible for curtailing foreign commercial fishing in U.S. waters. It established a science-based process for managing commercial fishing, and it virtually eliminated the overfishing in federal waters. However, there are also some key things that the MSA has not accomplished. There has always been a lack of focus on recreational fishing. There is a lack of specific policy to administer rec fishing. What they have done is they simply used the same policy that they developed for commercial fishing and applied it to recreational fishing. And this lack of a clear and a consistent recreational fishing policy has created many crisis conditions around our nation's coastlines. Pat, I promised not to talk about it, but I'm going to bring up Gulf Coast red snapper as an example. It's the most lopsided fishery management policy imaginable. There are 400 commercial permit holders in the Gulf of Mexico that are allowed to harvest 4.5 million pounds of red snapper. Approximately 3 million recreational fishermen in a 5-state area are allowed to fish for just 9 days, and they're allowed to keep just 1 fish per day. Now, this is unfortunate for those 3 million anglers, but it's tragic for those 5 Gulf states that border the Gulf of Mexico. They're losing tens of millions of dollars worth of recreational fishing revenue because these anglers can't get out on the water. People are in fact the most compelling reason for a more thoughtful recreational fishing policy. There are over 60 million recreational fishing participants in the U.S., 11 million in saltwater alone. Recreational fishing is the second most important outdoor activity in the United States, the second most popular outdoor activity in the United States. Only running, walking is more popular. I guess breathing is more popular too. Rec fishing has a huge impact on jobs in the economy. For all rec fishing, both freshwater and saltwater combined, it supports about 800,000 jobs in the United States, and it contributes about $115 billion to the economy. So let's take a minute and look specifically at the comparative impact of saltwater recreational fishing when compared to saltwater commercial fishing. Now, there have been some very confusing and misleading statistics that came out of the most recent National Marine Fisheries Service report titled Fisheries Economics in the United States 2012. Now, NMFS, after the fact, tried to correct this data, but they didn't republish the report. So that data, that misleading data, is still out there. Now, the original report correctly stated the value of saltwater recreational fishing at $58 billion annually. That's just saltwater recreational fishing. The same report stated the value of commercial fishing at $141 billion. So on the surface, it looked like commercial fishing had a far larger recreational, or far larger economic value than recreational fishing. But the devil is always in the detail. And that number included the value of imported seafood. Now, I know it's hard to believe when we're sitting up here in Alaska with all of your fishing bounty that you have, but 92% of the seafood that is consumed in the United States is imported. And guys, I'm not making this up. That's NMFS data directly from the National Marine Fisheries Service. In fact, all of the data that we're sharing with you today, the majority of it has come either from NMFS or from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when you correct that report and take out the imported seafood, the value of commercial fishing was reduced to $51 billion, according to NMFS. So $58 billion on the recreational side, $51 billion on the commercial side. But again, the devil's in the details. Of the $51 billion worth of annual economic value of the commercial fishing catch, over half of that is shellfish. So if you take out the shellfish and just look at finfish to put it on an equal plane with the recreational fishing value, you can see that there's an interesting comparison taking place. Now, the report with the inflated numbers is still out there, and unfortunately, that is the one that the press has picked up on. Mike Nessman has developed an interesting visual aid to explain this in more detail, and he's allowed me to plagiarize it. So I'm going to do that now. There are approximately 100 gumballs in this picture, and that represents all of the fish harvested in saltwater, in federal waters, finfish only, by both commercial and recreational anglers. This is all of the fish harvested in federal waters, saltwater, finfish. So, how many of those do you think are caught by recreational anglers? A third? 15%? 10%? 5%. Now, I know you don't fish saltwater very much, Bob, so the number would be much higher if you were out there. So, let's say we put all of the gumballs that represent the value of, I shouldn't say the value, the quantity of recreationally caught fish in saltwater. If we put them in this jar, let's see, I don't know if I can get them all in here. Let me see. That's it. That's the total number of fish, finfish, caught in saltwater by recreational anglers. This is the total number that are commercially harvested. So putting these side by side, I think even in the back of the room you can see there's a lot more gumballs in this picture. So the question I have for you, does it make sense to manage this fishery and this fishery the same? Do the same policies and guidelines apply equally to both of these? So let's put these two gumballs back in here. And now let's talk about job creation. Again, let's say this picture of gumballs represents all of the jobs created by finfish fisheries in federal waters. How many of them should go in this picture representing jobs created by recreational anglers versus commercial anglers? You saw that there were only 2% caught by recreational anglers. How many jobs are created by that 2%? Half?
More.
Who said more? You've heard this before. If I can pour this right. That's approximately how many jobs are created by those 2% of recreationally caught fish in saltwater. Now, how could that be? We're a lot better, apparently, at spending money than we are catching fish. So that's just a brief analogy that I wanted to share with you. So after we've looked at that, what do we feel really needs to happen to federal policy to reflect the value of recreational fishing to the nation? It's actually very simple. There's only 3 things that we think need to be applied at this time. Certainly, the new MSA language has to specifically address recreational fishing. We can't manage it with the same policy we developed to manage commercial fishing. They're both important, but they're very different. Also, we need to see the development of a national recreational fishing policy. Our government, the National Marine Fisheries Service specifically, has no policy for managing recreational fishing. Now, they've made the commitment to develop one, but that process is still in the infant stage, I think, to put it mildly. And lastly, we need to see a much broader understanding of the economic and even the social value of recreational fishing. So our panelists today are going to address each of these 3 points in more detail. Now, as we go forward, there are 2 key points that I want to make clear to everyone. This is not an either-or situation. Commercial fishing is very economically important, and that fact is abundantly clear to everyone in this room. However, recreational fishing is also very important, and that is not always clear. So our discussion today is not about commercial fishing or recreational fishing. It's about commercial fishing and recreational fishing with a more balanced approach to both. Now, before we begin, we are very pleased to have some initial statements from both Senator Murkowski and Senator Begich. And I'd like to begin today with some initial comments from Senator Murkowski. I would like to give you a little bit of background. I know everyone in this room probably knows Senator Murkowski. She is the first Alaskan-born senator and only the 6th United States senator to serve this state. She is the state's senior senator, and I can say personally, she is beyond passionate about this great state. She's a 3rd-generation Alaskan, born in Ketchikan and raised in towns across the state, and if I get this right, Wrangell, Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. Did I miss any?
Not yet.
Good. Well, I'm trying hard. She is the ranking member of the Committee on Energy and National Resources. She's a member of the Committee on Indian Affairs, Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and the Committee on Appropriations. Senator Murkowski supports Alaska fisheries and coastal communities through legislation and through her position on the Senate Appropriations Committee. She has also remained a fighter against genetically engineered salmon, what you call up here frankenfish. Please welcome Senator Lisa Murkowski.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you, and I'll remain seated because the mics are down here, but good to be with so many of you. Phil, appreciate the introduction. What you really omitted from that little background and biography are my fishing bona fides. You mentioned that I was born in Ketchikan and raised in places like Wrangell and Juneau. You can't come from the southeast without growing up around fisheries, both the commercial and the recreational fisheries. I married a guy that many of you know came to Alaska to fish here on the Kenai River. It was the Kenai that brought him from the lower 48, and it's the Kenai that I think has allowed him to remain anchored until I became his anchor. Our sons have spent many years here on the Kenai, and both now are working in the commercial side of the fisheries. So when you acknowledge right off the get-go that this is not a conversation about commercial or recreational, it's about the health of our fisheries. It's about accessing our fisheries as Alaskans and as Americans, and accessing them in a way that's sustainable, so that my kids and my kids' kids are going to be fishing and enjoying what so many of us can really relate to as part of who we are, part of our identity. Now, as we talk about the issues that we're focusing on at this forum, the National Recreational Fishing sector, I think it is important that we're here on the Kenai. I think it's interesting to note that we're here on the Kenai at a later time than we have had these forums in the past. There was a time when we would gather here on the Kenai to pursue the mighty Kenai King, and Phil Disco, you have been in the boat with me on several occasions when we have been successful with that. I've been successful, and he was there to witness it. Walter is on my wall today. But part of our reality is we're not seeing those returns coming back here with the Kings on this river. We're here in August fishing for silvers because our Kings have declined to a point where 2 years ago we had a federal fisheries disaster that was declared for the Cook Inlet region. When you think about the role that the federal government may have, one way that we can be of assistance is providing for those federal dollars that can help us better understand what's going on with our fisheries and understand the research. Also to appropriate funds that can help alleviate the economic impact from these fisheries disasters, and then to support actions to prevent their reoccurrence. So we worked pretty hard to get $75 million for 6 separate disasters around the country. Alaska received a little over $20 million dedicated to assist folks here in this state. And we worked pretty hard to make sure that disasters assistance would go not just to the commercial side, but also to the recreational fishery interests. So those direct and indirect jobs, whether it is the fishing guide on the Kenai, whether it is the accommodations in the area, the air charters, the related retailers, we all recognize, and you've pointed out very appropriately, I think, with your gumball example, the economic impact that comes to us from the recreational fishing sector. So one aspect of what we are looking at in the here and now as we deal with our immediate issues here on the Kenai Peninsula is how we make sure that we are not in a situation where we're continually fighting for limited federal dollars for disasters. That's not how we manage. And so we are working those issues, and we'll continue to work those. As it relates to the reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens and where we are moving forward, we clearly need to address the recreational fisheries issues that you have indicated. They simply have not received the attention that they need, that they require, and so this will be that opportunity with the reauthorization. The 3 points that you have outlined about the focus, a national recreational fisheries policy, these are going to be important for us, not only in this reauthorization, but I think recognizing that it's in our best interest to make sure that Americans have access to these recreational opportunities. We tried to move forward a bipartisan sportsman's bill just a month or so ago. It was a bill that enjoyed great support, 46 co-sponsors, evenly divided, Republicans and Democrats. Some good measures that were in it, and good measures that were supported by many of you on the panel, many of you that are here today. We had the Hunting, Fishing, and Recreational Shooting Protection Act, which would exempt the lead fishing equipment from TSCA, from the Toxic Substances Act. We also had a measure that I've introduced, the Recreational Fishing and Hunting Heritage Opportunities Act, to open up these areas to greater activity. I think it's something that we can work on collaboratively, but when stuff gets bogged down in the political process, it's tough to make good things happen. We're not going to see passage of Magnuson-Stevens in this Congress. I think we all recognize that, but what we can do, what we must do, is use this time to develop the good, strong policies going forward so that we do have a balanced and a proportional Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization that takes us well into the future with an equity towards our recreational fisheries that I think we're looking for, not only with this group, but that Alaskans and folks around the country will share. So I thank you for the leadership of so many on this issue and the opportunity to gain some highlight above and beyond what we know here in Alaska, but to take it up to the national level so Alaskans can become more aware, become more engaged, and better advocates with you. Know that we will certainly be your advocates on these issues. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Now we'd like to hear from Senator Begich. Senator Begich is in his 6th year representing Alaska in the U.S. Senate, where his primary focus has been to contribute towards the building of a strong Alaskan economy. Since his election to the Senate in 2008, Senator Begich has attained key leadership positions for Alaska, including positions on the Senate Appropriations Committee and Commerce, Indian Affairs, and Homeland Security committees. He is chair of the Commerce Committee's important subcommittee on oceans, atmosphere, fisheries, and Coast Guard, which has broad jurisdiction over important Alaska issues, including the reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens. As Senator Murkowski pointed out, this needs to be a very fair and balanced MSA reauthorization, and I can say with total confidence that Senator Begich's door is open to all sides. He listens to all opinions, he listens to every market segment and every stakeholder group, and I have confidence that the bill that is developed through his subcommittee will be fair and balanced to all. Senator Begich also works on behalf of servicemen and women through the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. Please welcome Senator Mark Begich.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you for doing this. I know we did this last year as kind of a test, and I think it was a great response last year, good conversation, and it really is an educational opportunity and also re-emphasizing the issues that we are aware of, but it gives us another opportunity to kind of talk about recreational sports fishing. Let me, if I can, Phil, I'm going to jump right into that piece of it, the MSA reauthorization. Part of the process that I've done over the last year plus on the MSA is to make sure that all sides are heard, that we make sure we talk about commercial and we talk about sports and rec, and also, and I would add, if I can, just a third element, and that's the issue of subsistence, specifically for Alaska. I held a meeting down here with the sports rec guys, and it was actually very interesting, and some of you might remember it, and we had the conversation going on, and it was that attitude that is so different than what I had seen for so many years previous of how do we make this work for all segments, not just one segment over another, who can take what from who, but how does it all work together and manage it in a way that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we can look back and once again say, not only for Alaska, but for the rest of the country, it is managed for sustainability and long-term value. And I want to really echo and give you all credit here at the panel and many of here in the room today for your willingness to kind of look from that perspective. As you know, we've had probably a dozen hearings, and we call them listening sessions. I call them hearings, but everyone has different titles, of hearing from folks about what the MSA should incorporate and how it should look at the end of the day. And recreational pieces, and I'm absolutely agree with you, Phil, when you look at the original and how it was drafted, it was focused on commercial because that was the big situation, the challenges we had, both nationally and internationally. But times have changed and kind of an evolution in the fisheries. And for the simple explanation, I'm just, if my son was here, he'd be grabbing some of those, just so you know, and I might too. Those are great props, but are they edible is the question.
They're a little stale.
They're a little stale. But your point is how you manage fisheries today. If you have just the footprint or the platform of we're going to manage it like commercial for all segments, subsistence, commercial, rec, sports, you're going to have a problem with your management, as we're experiencing some elements now. The work we've done, and you're right, the door is open. We've got some great input and some language that we've been able to start moving into the MSA reauthorization. We're in our second draft, and my co-partner on this is Ranking Member Senator Rubio, which is actually interesting, from Alaska to Florida. We were just talking about from your neck of the woods. But it's an amazing combination because we're both committed to getting a piece of legislation moving, because we think it's so important to understand the value of our fisheries. And again, when you think of the economic impact, you gave some incredible numbers. And I think we sometimes underestimate, to be frank with you, the value of it, of what's going on in the recreational end and commercial and subsistence, this economic value of the fisheries. The piece that was clear, and I did this very early on when I chairing the committee, was it was clear to me in NOAA the lack of understanding of the economic power and what it means. It's not just here's the landed weight of the fish and therefore that's it. If we really calculated out, you will all do that I'm sure later, about calculating out the cost of your per pound fish and all the equipment, the airline. You don't want to think about it. You want to think about the experience and just kind of let that weigh as the priority. That is an amazing economic driver. And when you think about it, it's not just on the docks. It's not just the few service facilities right on the dock. It's layered out multiple ways. It's families that say, we're going to go somewhere to do the recreational fishing, and therefore they're filling up their car with gas, they're getting food, they're getting equipment, they're getting their sleeping bag, if they're going to tent out, or they're going to figure out a hotel room. Before you know it, that economic value is pretty significant. NOAA has never been fully equipped to do that, and just to be very frank with you. And part of our MSA reauthorization is try to get them more equipped to understand their job and responsibility to understand this economic engine, so we manage it recognizing that. So when you say, and a good example, I'm amazed that you said red snapper. I know, I felt the pain with you. Yeah. 9 days, I don't even know you can call that a season. But the economic impact of now going to 9 days, of those days that were lopped off, is huge and generational, because to rebuild that support to that industry and the recreational side is very difficult. Once it's gone, you got to rebuild it. It's very expensive and very time consuming. So from my position as chair of the fisheries subcommittee that's dealing with the reauthorization, the recreational piece, that's why I've enjoyed last year's, this year's, and the many other formats and the hearings we've had. As you know, sometimes those hearings don't include rec, and we've included them. We made sure rec was at the table. And we're going to continue to do that. And the other piece on the national recreational fisheries policy, I've talked to Eileen about this. I'm going to see the Commerce Secretary tomorrow in Anchorage and in Fairbanks. We're going to have a continued conversation. And they should expedite this, because as we work on the MSA reauthorization, this should not be something, well, we'll wait till that's done and then we'll look down the road. These go hand in hand, and we should recognize that as part of the equation. The last thing I'll say is, and maybe I'm a little more optimistic, maybe it's my naiveness of 6 years only on the Senate. I'm looking forward to try to get this thing done before the end of the year. It's going to be tough. But I think where we are today, remember the first draft we had, there was a lot of issues, and that's why we called it a discussion draft. The second draft, I think, really cleaned up a lot of the concerns people had. We still have some more tweaking to do, but we're going to try to push. We may not be successful before the year's out, but I can tell you that come January, if we're not successful this session, come January, we will reintroduce this bill rapidly, because we cannot sit around and continue to do what Congress does for many years. They like to postpone things because they don't want to make the decision. Fisheries issues are tough. You know it, I know it, but we have to resolve these issues so we move the bill forward, and at the end of the day have long-term impact of sustainability for all levels of fisheries, and the management will be different in certain elements. There's no question about it. So I'm going to be more optimistic, Lisa, because I just want to feel that way about it, because if I don't, I will not, we need to do 150%, and at the end of the day, we'll see where it lays. And again, I can't thank you all enough for your continual individual input and these forums here and our listening sessions. And lastly, I'll just say this, that I won't be able to join the Classic for Fisheries, but it's probably good. My wife is with me this time. The last time she was at the Classic, was fishing on the Classic on the king salmon, you caught a 63-pounder. Wow. Am I close? And I think she threw back a 35. I think that shocked the people in the boat when she said that's too small and threw it back. And I thought, 63-pounder. So we're going to save you, even though it's not kings this time. But we wish the Classic well. But thank you guys for doing what you're doing. And as you know, our door is wide open, and we'll continue. And just to point out, I don't know where Shauna, I was going to point out Shauna, because Shauna is my state director for those that may not know her, and Kim is my district director down here, and then my wife. Deborah should wave. This is how I get to go to dinner with her tonight. So when we go next door for dinner, we're looking forward to it. Thank you all very much.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Begich. We really appreciate the comments from both Senator Murkowski and Senator Begich. Next, we'd like to hear from each of our panelists. First, Pat Murray will explain exactly what sort of language recreational fishermen would like to see in the MSA reauthorization. Next, Mike Nessman will address the development of the National Recreational Fishing Policy. He's intimately involved in that. And lastly, Tom Domerck will address the economics of rec fishing and boating combined in a very compelling way that we don't normally see. So we're going to start with you today, Pat.
Phil, thank you. And thank you for mentioning red snapper before I have to. It's funny, when we were here last year, I said there will come a day when we'll gather in Alaska and talk about MSA and not say Gulf red snapper. And today's not that day. It was funny, last year I used a little quote from a Scottish philosopher, and I wanted to kind of kick this off with one from an American philosopher, a little fellow from Omaha named Warren Buffett. And I think it's really appropriate for the MSA process and what we're going through, and we'll all be going through collectively. And the quote is that someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago. And I think there's two levels to that. I think the first one is there's an orchard of trees that have been planted by recreational anglers through sacrifice, through conservation, through advocacy, through vision. And sadly, in some regions in the Gulf and in the South Atlantic, we see areas and fisheries where recreational anglers are sitting out in the sun watching others in the shade. And so as we move through this process, I think we have an opportunity to rectify some of those and maybe plant some other trees that will last for those generations that we were talking about and generations beyond that. I want to hit 4 key points. There's a lot of points in MSA, as everyone in here knows, but I think there's 4 key ones that are worth prioritizing. First one's allocation. And I'm not going to say that's the most important, but it would probably be pretty close to the list, particularly, again, when you look at the Southeast. Allocation has been such a challenge. The federal management councils have been largely unwilling or unable or both to reallocate. Not to get too weedy, but Amendment 28, which endeavored to probably begin the process. It was at least a strong first step to reallocate Gulf red snapper, and it had some momentum and then got tabled. And then, yes, sir.
When you say Southeast for Alaskans, you mean Southeast United States?
I mean Southeast United States. Yes, I do.
Some Alaskans probably don't Southeast.
Well, no, thankfully for you, you have no Gulf red snapper. You best hope their range doesn't expand there. We'll give you a few of them if you want them. And so we see Amendment 40 rapidly moving through the council that really is seeking to move some of that quota that right now recreational anglers would have among a handful of charter for hire folks. So there's something wrong there. There's something that's not working, and we have an asymmetrical system in place. And it really speaks to the need for an independent process, a new way to look at allocating fisheries and using current data and looking at what is the best use for the nation. Some time back, someone coined a phrase that said that allocations were rusted shut. And I thought that was really a great way to say it. But I almost think we should amend that now and say they've been welded shut, because there's almost an intention to it. It's been such a persistent neglect that there's got to be something to explicitly express the need to examine that reallocation as we work through MSA. Next point is expanding that management toolbox. We talked about that a little bit last year when we were here, but there's some wonderful models in the states to manage fisheries differently and really focus on recreational anglers. I think there's a number of parts to that. Some of it, and I'll speak about science in a moment. There's a science part where we have real-time science that'll allow the catch to flow with the stock. I think that's critically important. We look at fisheries in the Gulf like red drum, speckled trout, snook that are managed amazingly well. I think there's some lessons that we can learn there and not taking a one-size-fits-all approach. Phil mentioned earlier how effective MSA has been with commercial fisheries, and I think for the most part it really, really has. If we could get that level of success with rec fisheries, well, I wouldn't be talking about Gulf red snapper. So I think that's going to be a key focus. Exempted fishing permits, that's something that is a tactical tool that is now being used to implement policy. We've seen that with reallocation of fisheries for charter for hire, and some explicit language there would be very useful. And then, of course, probably one of the paramount is science. We've got to have more fishery independent science. That will allow us to base our management not on 4- and 5-year-old stock assessments, but on contemporary data. And that way we'll get something that will match where the stock is at that point, and we'll probably not only get better management, but alleviate some of the disenfranchised group of recreational anglers we have right now, because sometimes the reality just isn't matching what the management is doing. So I think if we can remember the sage Mr. Buffett's quote and embrace that opportunity, I think we can gain a lot of ground in this next reauthorization. So thank you. Back to you, Phil.
Mike, you're up next.
Phil, thank you. And Senators, let me thank both of you for your support of the Sportsman's Act and the work that went into trying to get that considered and passed. Well, we hope not. We'd like to see that get passed. We certainly support it very strongly, and thank you for that. But on to the more relevant topic here today, and that is National Recreational Fishing Policy. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. over the last 20 or 25 years and have learned one thing, that Washington is a town of policy. We love policy. We talk about policy all the time. We talk about energy policy and healthcare. Boy, do we talk about healthcare policy. We talk about, you know, foreign policy, transportation policy. One thing we don't talk about in DC, or at least I've never heard, is recreation policy. Fact is, the federal government is an incredibly large provider of recreation, but they don't really know it or acknowledge it quite often. They sort of back into it. We've got all this land, all this water. Okay, well, we can recreate on it, but they don't focus on the dollars that come from it, on the opportunity that comes from it, all the good things. So as we think about part of the challenge in front of us as a community, we think one thing that would be very helpful would be for us as a nation, for the Department of Commerce and for the NOAA to establish a national recreational policy for saltwater angling. We think that would be helpful. What does a policy do? Well, a policy really sort of establishes your goals, your direction, your focus, your objectives. It gives you some place to go. I think too often in the past in recreation, particularly in recreational fisheries in salt water, we've sort of been driven by a concept that, you know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And that's largely where we've gone, is down a whole bunch of roads that haven't really taken us anywhere. So we think that this Magnuson reauthorization gives us a tremendous opportunity to move our vision, not just the recreational communities, but our nation's vision forward as we think about recreation and more specifically, recreational fishing. I think we can move it forward by thinking about Americans getting outside, having a great time, in this instance in fishing in saltwater. By thinking about the economics that are involved. And so it's not surprising to me that the Morris Deal Commission, when they did their work, they came up, one of their first recommendation was to establish this exact kind of policy. So I mean, the good news there is the National Marine Fisheries Service, I think, quickly picked up on the fact that there was some validity to the point, and they've made one of their commitments to us as a community to go forth and move forward a policy, a recreational policy that we hopefully have been involved in, will continue to be involved in, and that will get developed in the very near future. We think that's a first. I mean, it's not the only step we need, but it's really important to know where you're going if you ever intend to get there. And we think that can help us know when we're there. What are we talking about specifically? Well, the key points from our perspective is anglers really aren't very good at fishermen. They only do it on the average 10 times a year. For us to be successful, we need abundant fish stocks out there. We need a lot of fish in the water. We want healthy stocks. If we don't have healthy stocks, awfully hard for anglers to be successful and the industries that depend on those anglers to be successful. We want NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service, and their management to produce the full range of benefits that come from recreational fishing. The economic, the social, and the conservation benefits. And we want our resources, our natural resources, our fishery resources, to be managed in a way that brings about the greatest benefit to the nation. Not just sort of, well, we've always done it this way, so we're going to continue to do it this way. And lastly, I think important part of that policy would be to recognize that, and this is an example we've used before, that recreational activities are inherently different than commercial activities. You know, recreation is like me growing tomatoes in my backyard garden and trying to use the same policies to regulate me as you would agribusiness. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So those are 4 specific things we think need to be included in a recreation policy. Thank you.
Tom, it's your turn.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Senators, for being with us today. You know, Mike talks about the federal government being a huge provider of recreation in this country, and they are. But many in those agencies that provide recreation perceive recreation as something you do with leftover time, leftover money, and leftover land. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Outdoor Industry Association estimates that Americans spend directly $646 billion a year on outdoor recreation. And boating and fishing represents 1 out of every $5 spent on outdoor recreation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about boating and fishing numbers today, because boating and fishing are tied together at the hip. 70% of all recreational boats are used for recreational fishing. And Americans spend each year almost $37 billion directly on boating products. It's an industry, it's an American industry that of about 35,000 companies that employ just under 340,000 people. And you can do a little arithmetic and quickly figure out that there's a lot of small businesses in the recreational boating and fishing industry. In fact, 97% of all boat manufacturers are small businesses. Now, 88 million Americans went boating last year, and Phil talked about 60 million fishermen, and that computes about right, because about 70% of those 88 million Americans who went boating to go fishing. They spent, according to the U.S. Coast Guard, they took 300 million boating trips in 2012. They spent 3 billion hours on the water. This is a big business. It drives, boating alone drives $83 billion in annual spending, $40 billion in annual labor income. And I said, it's an American industry. 93% of all the boats sold in the United States are built in the United States. So it's good, middle-class American workers making recreational products for middle-class Americans, because 73% of all boat owners have a household income of less than $100,000 a year. This is not the top 1%. This is the middle-class America. And Phil's already talked a little bit about the saltwater fishing numbers. 11 million saltwater recreational fishing anglers in this country, producing an annual economic output of over $70 billion, supporting over 450,000 jobs and generating over $20 billion of annual labor income. The boating and fishing communities are directly tied, the success of the boating and fishing communities are directly tied to the health of and access to our nation's aquatic resources. That's why, through fishing license purchases, through excise taxes on fishing equipments and motorboat fuels, and donations to conservation efforts, recreational fishermen and boaters contribute about $1 billion annually to fisheries conservation and public access improvements. That's a number or an amount that there's no other group comes close to matching. It's clear that the senators do not fall in the category of this next comment, but there are many beyond your two Alaskan senators who have a general lack of understanding of the economic, social, and conservation values of recreational fishing. And and that has been a detriment to our community in policy decisions. And this is nowhere more glaring than in saltwater recreational fisheries. Policymakers and fishery managers have devoted the vast majority of their attention toward managing commercial fishing sustainability. In large part because, as Phil showed, they take 98% of the fish harvest. Commercial fishing is important. We all acknowledge that. But recreational fishing is also important, and unfortunately has long been an afterthought in terms of research, in terms of data collection, in terms of management focus. But those 2% of the fish caught by recreational fishermen support a substantial economic engine that is, as we saw, roughly equivalent to commercial fishing. Unfortunately, as Phil also related, NOAA recently helped contribute to this misperception that commercial fishing dominates recreational fishing sector in terms of economic impacts this year when they released their Fisheries Economics of the United States 2012 report, in which they changed the way they reported economic impact. Previously, they separated imports from domestic industry figures and reported each separately. In the latest report, the agency eliminated that distinction and simply published a total that included both domestic and imported seafood lumped together. Fortunately, due to some urging on the part of recreational fishermen, the agency took steps to correct the report by releasing data that separates out the imported seafood from the domestically caught seafood. When imported seafood, which is not regulated or managed by NIMS, is removed from the equation, the corrected data show that recreational fishing is actually about $7 billion a year larger than commercial fishing. And that in 2012, the economic impact of commercial fishing actually declined $2.3 billion. Now, the purpose of all these numbers and economic statistics is not to diminish the importance of commercial fishing industry. We, as it's been said several times, we're not talking about either or here. We all recognize that commercial fishing supports many jobs and coastal communities along all of our nation's coasts. However, NIMS and MSA have focused almost exclusively on the commercial sector, to the detriment of what is, by NIMS' own numbers, an equally important recreational fishing sector. We believe it's long overdue to finally elevate recreational fishing to receive the level of attention and resources and priority that that corresponds with its economic importance to our nation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and also thanks to you, Mike, and to you, Pat. Your presentations have given us a lot to digest and a lot to think about. I'd like to close by thanking each of you for being here today. Especially, I'd like to thank Senator Murkowski and Senator Begich, as well as the panelists and, of course, our VIP guests. Lastly, and certainly not least, I'd like to thank the Kenai River Sport Fishing Association for allowing us to have this event in conjunction with the Kenai River Classic for the second year in a row. Now, as you've heard from the panelists, the language that will be present in the final authorization or reauthorization of MSA is vitally important to tens of millions of recreational fishermen from all around the country and certainly here in Alaska. The timely development of a national recreational fishing policy, as Mike talked about, is crucial. Until we have one, we won't know what it is we're trying to do. And lastly, as Tom pointed out, it is time, perhaps past time, for the real economic importance of recreational fishing to be recognized alongside that of commercial fishing. As we've said throughout the presentations today, ultimately, this is not an either-or situation. We need national oversight of our valuable saltwater fishery that reflects the best interests of both commercial and recreational fishermen, as well as subsistence fishermen and all of the other stakeholder groups. So essentially, this concludes our presentation today. And I would like to ask either Senator Murkowski or Senator Begich if they have any final comments, and then we're going to excuse them because we know you're very busy people today and you've got a lot of items still on your agenda for the rest of the day. After they are excused, we're going to take any questions from the audience that you may have for myself or any of the other panelists. So first, Senator Murkowski, do you have any final comments?
Well, it might not be in way of a comment so much as a query to our panelists. And first, I appreciate the comments from each of you and the contributions that we'll have as part of this discussion. As I listen, though, and we think about a national recreational policy, those things that we can strive to, that will reinforce and make the recreational sector stronger, more robust. How important is it to ensure that a national policy reinforces the reach out to young people? I am engaged with the Classic here with a day that we call the Kenai Kids Classic. And we take young kids out, many of whom have never been on a fishing boat, many of whom have never held a rod in their hands, and yet they're kids that may be living here on the Kenai Peninsula. I think about what my husband did when our boys were little. He would take all the neighborhood kids out and pile them in a boat with their life jackets on. He taught them how to fish. But so many young people in this country today, and in this state where we live and breathe fishing, don't have access to that. And if you don't grow up with it, you're not comfortable with it. You don't get out on the ocean. You don't feel like you have an ability to even take this on. You look at it and you say, well, it's a little bit expensive. I might get seasick. I don't even know how to clean a fish. How important from a national policy perspective is this reach out to our kids, basically teaching them how to fish? And I throw it out more as a point of consideration. I think it's important that we factor this in, but I'm curious to hear your responses to it.
Well, Mike, I'm going to let you address this, but to be clear, there are many aspects of the National Recreational Fishing Policy, but one thing we want to make sure we don't lose sight of is we want to give the regional councils a tool to implement policy for recreational fishing. Today, they don't feel empowered to do so. As Pat said, the door is welded shut. So we need to make sure that that national recreational policy is a tool that the regional councils can use to break out of this situation that they're in, where it's all about commercial fishing and we don't have a voice at the regional council level. I think other parts of this would certainly, to Mike's point, the federal government doesn't recognize that recreation is a business.
Right.
And we certainly want kids involved in fishing. Mike, why don't you address this?
Well, Senator, I would say that we think that's an incredibly important issue. And as a matter of fact, there's a group called the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation whose charge is to look at that very issue. Tom was chair of that. Phil was on that board. I'm on that board. So we take it very, very seriously. You know, this world is changing. The demographics we're facing now, the world I grew up in isn't the world that kids are growing up in now, and in 20 years it'll be a very, very different world. And all of our natural resource issues, if we don't introduce people to those natural resources so they understand them, they know them, they care about them, I find it very difficult to believe we're going to put the priority on natural resources that we do now, 25 years from now. Fishing is one way to reach out to them, all sorts of outdoor recreation. You know, I'm fond of saying that in Washington they're scared of the F word. It terrifies them. Fun. And I tend to think that you know, one way you get kids involved in the outdoors is you let them have fun. And if they have fun, they're going to like it. They're going to enjoy it. They're going to do it when they grow up. So I think it's really important.
Well, no, it's something that I want to put a priority on. I think many in the audience have probably read Last Child in the Woods. When our young people feel like they don't have any connection to their earth, you know, things are different when kids check out. So this is something that I think from a long-term perspective we need to pay attention. I appreciate that. I'm actually going to stick around as long as I can because I'd like to hear the questions from the audience. But thank you again for all those that have spoken and for my colleague here. Appreciate it.
Senator Begich, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you. Phil, thank you very much to all of you. Great presentations as usual. You know, and hopefully one day we won't be talking about red snapper, but except saying how many we caught and other things of that nature. But let me, if I can, you have 3 items on your list, and I do want to echo what Senator Murkowski said about the young people. I think it is important that as you work through, and we talk about a national policy, that the youth component is significantly highlighted. But if I can add a 4th, and maybe it's a small 4, but one that's critical, as we think of a new policy, when we think of all the issues we just talked about on making sure there is follow-up and follow-through in the science and all those pieces, one of the equations is going to be making sure that we don't just pass an MSA or a national policy that also doesn't have some teeth behind it, meaning the financial resources to make sure the science is there, making sure that when we want to do stock assessments like on the Northeast, they don't do stock assessments every 3 years or 5 years. They actually do them on an annual basis. Or as we think of science, we're not just saying what's the best available, because sometimes the best available is no science. And as you know, the way the federal regulations work, that's what they use as part of the reason sometimes to answer questions that work against the fishing industry in a lot of ways. So I think we have, both Senator Murkowski and I have kind of a unique role because we're both not only care about these issues, but we are on the Appropriations Committee. So we have to make sure we have that second level that as a policy is developed or as regional councils are reviewing these issues and how to incorporate them, or when we think about the science we need and making sure that the data is there so we can make sure we're doing the right kind of long-term management of our fisheries, or we have the right toolbox in place, or the economic studies, that we have also the financial support that is necessary, not only from the private sector that is very, been very generous. I mean, this report, I got to meet both Johnny and Scott when they presented this to me, and it's a great report. But this is one piece of the puzzle, and I think that's something we can't forget in all this, because otherwise we'll have a nice report, we'll have a nice regional or national plan, we'll have an MSA bill, and then 5 years or 6 years or 8 years later, we'll have a meeting like this, and we'll say, you know, we didn't manage this properly because we didn't have the science, or we didn't do this properly because we didn't do the economic studies that told us the value, because we didn't have the resources to do it. So I would just, and one thing I know about the recreational industry, the fishing industry especially, the sports and the sportsman groups, as the sportsman bill laid out, no one's afraid not to pay for these things. We just want to plan and how to do it and where it goes and put it back into the resource development and preservation or habitat protection as well as expansion of the industry. So I just want to kind of put that as a flag, if that's okay. And as you're thinking about these, I'm going to be interested in knowing, as we do this, what are those financial tools we need to make sure are protected in the budget process, and where are we lacking? You know, we're doing some stuff right now on duck stamps because of the lack of resources for habitat protection for duck hunting and so forth. That was in the sportsman bill as another example. But if you could kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're moving forward, that would be helpful for me as we develop the final MSA. So then we take that policy and then we also put the resources necessary to make sure that policy becomes reality. So I just want to kind of put that on the record. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. And you're right, I got a heavy schedule, so I'll leave Lisa Murkowski here and I'll head off to my next
Thank
thing.
you.
But thank
If
you.
you could just give me 2 minutes.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, for a response, yeah. And I can't believe you just said 2 minutes, Phil.
Well, no,
I'm
truly
very
will be 2
impressed.
I want to say, probably should turn my mic on first.
What was on?
It was on.
Most of us live in other parts of the country. We're not from Alaska. I live about as far from Alaska as you can get and still be considered a U.S. citizen. I live in the Gulf of Mexico. I want everyone here from Alaska to understand how blessed you are by the people that you send to Washington. These two senators get the issues about recreational fishing. Their doors are open to us. They talk, they engage, they understand, they know. So I just want, I know for Senator Begich in particular, this is an election year. You are blessed with the people that you send to Washington. And I'd have to include Congressman Young in that total as well. They always fight for Alaska, Alaskan issues, and particularly for recreational fishing and commercial fishing and subsistence fishing. So we are truly blessed to have them in Washington, and I would like to thank all of you for electing them.
I wanted to